Chapter 52. So this chapter is called Population Ecology. We got an introduction to the discipline of ecology in the last video series covering chapter 51. And now we're going to turn our attention to how populations change in time. And so the book gives a starting scenario to get you situated by talking about rabbits. So Australia is, as you know, an island nation slash continent in the South Pacific. And in the late 1900s, an Australian rancher um, imported some European rabbits. So European rabbits, there are no rabbits in Australia until Australian rancher dude brought the rabbits in and he released them. So I guess he was probably thinking, I like to hunt rabbits and there's no rabbits around here, so I'll release a couple of rabbits and they'll reproduce and I'll be able to hunt some rabbits and have some rabbit stew. Well, rabbits reproduce like rabbits, so really quickly. And so they have 4 or 5 offspring in each litter, and they have a litter every month or so. And plus, they didn't have any natural predators, so there weren't foxes and hawks that eat. Maybe there's hawks, I don't know, but there weren't very many predators that ate the rabbits. So you can imagine what happened next. The rabbit population exploded, and about 50 years after this rancher released that initial group of rabbits, there were 20 million rabbits that covered much of the continent of Australia. And so their advance was so widespread and so dramatic. And by the way, they were eating everything. And so they were really damaging the local ecosystem. The government of Australia tried to respond by building a rabbit-proof fence. So at the time, this was the longest fence in the world. Maybe it's still the longest fence, I don't know. But they basically tried to build this fence in order to prevent the rabbits from spreading. Although, so the story goes, as they were finally connecting the sections of this fence and making it one long continuous unit, the workers looked on one side of the fence and saw rabbits and looked on the other side of the fence and saw rabbits. So it didn't really work. This is just showing the expansion of the rabbits. So you can see in the 19th century, this is where the rancher lived originally. And so you can see that the rabbits just spread throughout much of the continent over over the next 50 years. Now the rabbits mostly inhabit the southern part of the continent, but they can be found here and there throughout the entire continent. So what have they done to the rabbits since then? Since the fence didn't work, well, they released predators, but those predators created their own problems and didn't really do much to impact the rabbit population. Scientists in the 1950s released they imported a virus from Europe, or from South America rather, and the Australian rabbits didn't have any resistance to it. So the virus killed like 99% of the rabbits really quickly. And then over time, the rabbits gained resistance to the virus, so it didn't really work. So anyway, it's been this ongoing struggle. What was the point of that story? Well, we might have been able to predict what these rabbits would do when they were initially released if we understood their role in the ecosystem, if we understood how long they lived, how quickly they can move, their ratio of males to females, how quickly they reproduce, how much parental care they give, how many babies they have with each litter, and so on and so forth. So those are all aspects of population dynamics, and that's the subject of this chapter. So population dynamics is defined as how the characteristics of populations change through time and vary from place to place. So when we study the population dynamics of a particular population, this is a list of some of the things that we might take into account. And I already listed some of them already in my discussion about the rabbits, but we might look at their geographical range. So where can they live? Do they like to live in temperate regions or deserts or tropical forests, or what habitats do they live inside of those biomes? How big are they? Are they big? Are they small? Do they live in high density or low density? How do they disperse over the environment, over the landscape? What are their rates of immigration and emigration? What's their sex ratio? So how many males versus females are born? How long do they live? At what age do they start reproducing? How many births do they have compared to how many deaths? How many of them survive to old age? And so on and so forth. So these are all different characteristics that a scientist would use to study any population. And that's what this chapter is all about. So let's talk about these different factors. So first is population size. This is simply the number of individuals in a population at a particular time. So what's the population size of squirrels on Milligan's campus? Well, we could go out and count the number of squirrels on the campus, and whatever number we came up with, that would be the population size. We might want to take into account how much area we're dealing with. And so population density is the number of individuals per unit of area in a habitat. So in that case, we might not just be satisfied by saying, hey, the population size of gray squirrels on Milligan's campus is 30. Maybe we'll say, well, Milligan's campus is, I have no idea, what, 20 acres? And so if there's 30 squirrels for 20 acres, then we could do the math and figure out the population density. Why do we care? Because population size and density are related, and knowing them provides more information about the relationship of that population to the resources it uses. So if our population size of gray squirrels is 2 versus 200, or our density is 2 squirrels per acre versus 20 squirrels per acre, then that's going to make a big difference in the number of acorns they eat and the number of predators that they attract, and so on and so forth. Populations are going to follow different dispersal patterns, right? And so we can say that populations vary in their dispersion. Well, let me define dispersion. Dispersion is the spatial distribution of individuals within the geographical range. So the geographical range is just the area in which you'll find a particular species. So dispersion is how they're distributed in that geographic range. And dispersion follows 3 types: clumped, random, and uniform. So this is an example of a clumped dispersion pattern. So if you go out and you sample this particular coral reef, you'll find that these redfish are not just spread throughout, they're clumped. So you find a school of fish here and a school of fish there and a school of fish here. Why would they be clumped? Well, they're probably going to be clumped because they're all feeding on a particular resource, perhaps, or maybe they are living in social groups, so you're likely to find them in a school, and they do that because that way they can find mates, or maybe they can cooperate in finding food or rearing offspring, or preventing getting eaten by predators. Or maybe it's because of the way they reproduce. Maybe they lay all their eggs in one spot, and then all those eggs hatch, and then you got a bunch of next generation that's all clumped together in more or less the same location. So that's clumped. The second dispersion pattern is random. And so in random dispersion, basically the individuals are distributed unpredictably. So in other words, you don't really find a pattern. So what would lead to this? Well, it could just be that they're randomly distributed because maybe like these dandelions, they produce seeds and the seeds blow in the wind, and the wind more or less randomly drops these seeds on the landscape. And so where you find the dandelions is just a product of where the wind happened to be blowing on a particular day. The third type of dispersal pattern is uniform. So if you look at these sage bushes in the desert, or creosote bushes in the desert, you find that they're spaced out, right? And so they're if you measure the distance between them, they're more or less equidistant from one another. Why would they be uniform? Well, in uniform dispersion, usually your resources are limiting. So in the case of these creosote bushes, there's not enough water to go around. So if 2 bushes pop up right next to each other, they're going to compete for water. One is going to die and the other one's going to live, right? And then if another bush pops up really far away, then the roots from those 2 bushes are only going to go so far, and maybe there's room for a third bush to pop up in between them. So the point is, you get separation among individuals, and that's dictated by the distribution of resources. Another factor we might study is age structure. So age structure is just the number of individuals in each age class. Why would we care about age structure? Well, if you're studying the squirrels, to go back to them, and let's say it's a young population of squirrels, so most of them are, a year old at the most. Well, that means that they're going to have plenty of time to live out their life cycle. They're going to reach reproductive maturity, and they're going to start having babies. So a population that has a young age structure is going to have the potential to grow rapidly. Conversely, if that squirrel population was a bunch of old, feeble squirrels, then they're beyond their reproductive years, they're more susceptible to disease, and that population, in all likelihood, will decrease in the coming years. So age structure is important to know if we want to predict the behavior of a population. Generation time is another population characteristic that we want to pay attention to. Generation time is the average time between the birth of an organism and the birth of its offspring. So generation time is usually short in species that can reproduce at a young age. And generation time is usually long when species live longer and it takes them a long time to reach reproductive age. So populations that have a short generation time, they're going to have the ability to have their population grow really quickly, whereas populations that have a longer generation time, it's going to have a much slower growing population. Right? Generation time is also linked to body size. So the smaller the organism, the shorter the generation time. Bacteria, for example, are really small, just one cell, and they can reproduce and double their population size in just a matter of hours. Whereas if you're an elephant, right, and you're really large, or you're a blue whale, then it takes a long time for you to grow up and find a mate and have a baby and raise the baby. And so larger animals tend to have longer generation times. Sex ratio is the proportions of males and females in a population. Why would we care about that? Because females are the ones that are doing the reproducing. So sure, males provide DNA in their sperm, but really the number of females is going to have the biggest impact on the number of babies that are born. So if a population has more females than males, then we would expect that population to grow faster than one that has more males than females. And again, this is because it's only the females that are really producing the offspring, and one male can mate with multiple females. So the number of males isn't as important to population growth over time as the number of females. Why do I have these pictures on here? Because I was really struggling to provide pictures. This is a cat that just ate a female sparrow. So a lot of times females are at greater risk of predation or starving to death because they're the ones investing in reproduction, so that can skewer a sex ratio. And I was going to talk about this, but it's actually kind of complicated. This is just showing the proportions of males and females in different shorebird populations and its effect on parenting behavior. If you're curious about that, I put the link in the notes section on the PowerPoint. So when we're looking at populations, we also want to pay attention to the birth of individuals and the movement of individuals, and also the death of individuals. So demography or demographics is the study of the processes that change a population's size and density through time. So what factors are going to change a population's size and density through time? Well, one factor is emigration and immigration. So immigration with an I is when an individual joins a population, and emigration with an E is when an individual moves out of a population. So in the graphic, you can see that in this case, the population number 1 had an individual leave. It emigrated with an E. And population number 2, that same individual is the immigrant. So what impact is this going to have on the populations? Well, this population got smaller and less dense, and this population got larger and more dense. So if we want to study a population over time, we need to know immigration and immigration rates. All right, we'd also like to know how individuals in a population survive. So we can build survivorship curves for different populations in order to display the rate of survival over the species' average lifespan. So in other words, we're just tracking, hey, if there's 1,000 sheep born in a particular season, and if those sheep live for 10 years, well, how many of those same baby sheep are alive after 1 year or 5 years or 10 years? So we use that data to build survivorship curves. And what we find is that species fall into one of three types. So there's three main types of survivorship curves, helpfully named type 1, type 2, and type 3. So a sheep, as you can see in the graphic that's on the screen, a sheep displays type 1 survivorship curve. So here we've got 1,000 sheep that were born, and I don't know how long they live, let's say 10 years. So after 10 years, we've still got a little bit less than 1,000 sheep. After 5 years, we've got still about 1,000 sheep. And then not until we get into 8, 9, and 10 years, 100% of their lifespan, do we see the numbers drop off. So this is called a type 1 survivorship curve. So a type 1 curve has really high survivorship until late in life. So the organisms that are born tend to live a long time and then die in their old age. It's true for sheep, and it also happens to be true for humans. So the majority of human babies that are born are going to live into their 60s, 70s, and not until they get into their 80s and 90s do we see mortality rate go up. Why would species display a type 1 survivorship curve? Well, there's lots of reasons. A few of the highlights include there's not many offspring that are born. So in the case of humans, just one or maybe two are born at a time. And so that means that there's not competition with siblings for offspring or for mates or whatever, or there's less competition. There's also a lot of parental care. So a lot of mammals have type 1 survivorship curves because they provide parental care. They nurse their young with milk, they protect them, they live in social groups, and so all of those things help them live longer. Type 2 survivorship curves display a pattern in which there's a constant rate of mortality across all age classes. So in other words, it doesn't matter how old you are, your chance of dying each year remains about the same. So a lot of songbirds, some small mammals like mice, as well as lots of reptiles like the lizard you see here or the skink. It doesn't matter if you're a newly born lizard or a old lizard, your chance of dying is about the same as you progress through your lifetime. That might be because there's less parental care, or there's more competition for resources, or there's more babies born in each litter. So type 2 survivorship curve. Compare that with type 3. So type 3 is kind of the opposite of type 1. In type 3, it's mostly the young that die. And if you can survive to a certain proportion of the lifespan, so maybe if we're talking about a plant, if you can make it through the first 2 years, then you've got a good chance of living to an old age. Why would we see type 3 survivorship curve? Well, I'm going to use the example of plants to illustrate it. Sorry, I just created a pencil. How do I get that pencil off? How do I get that out of here? There we go. Oh, now I'm advancing. Sorry about that. So type 3 survivorship curve, like with a plant, imagine an oak tree that puts out a ton of acorns, thousands and thousands of acorns. So of those, let's say they make 1,000 acorns. How many of those acorns are going to make it through the first 6 months? They're going to get eaten by squirrels and weevils, or they're going to get stepped on, or they're going to land on a rocky place and not be able to grow. And so the vast majority of those acorns are going to die. So we see a high rate of mortality early on. However, for the acorns that can root and get sunlight and water and they don't get eaten, then they're going to become established, and eventually those acorns are going to grow into a tall oak tree and it's difficult to kill an oak tree. A squirrel can't kill an oak tree. It's hard for insects to kill an oak tree. The wind's not going to knock it over. They've got a big root system and lots of leaves so they can get the resources they need. So once they get to a certain age and a certain size, then they have a good chance of living to the full extent of their lifespan. So high mortality early on versus low mortality late in life, basically the opposite of type 1. So when it comes to organisms, we can compare and contrast different life histories among species. So a life history is simply the lifetime patterns of growth, maturation, and reproduction that maximizes the number of surviving offspring that an individual produces. So every species has its own particular life history. We saw that in the last slide. A sheep is going to have a life history where it will grow relatively slowly, it will mature relatively slowly, it will have a few offspring, it will have lots of parental care, and they'll have really high survivorship until they're old. An oak tree will grow slowly, it will produce lots of offspring, it will have zero parental care, and they'll have high mortality early on, but really low mortality late in their lifespan. So these are just different life histories. So these different life histories are influenced by energy budgets. The energy budget is the total amount of energy that an organism can accumulate and use to fuel its activities. So each organism can use energy. So if you're an oak tree, you're going to be using sunlight and water and CO2. If you're a sheep, you're going to be getting energy from the grass that you're eating. And the way that you spend that energy is going to be in a way, hopefully, that maximizes your survival and reproduction. And the way that a sheep spends its energy is going to be different than the way that a plant or an oak tree spends its energy, right? But when we talk about how an organism spends its energy, we can split it up into three categories: maintenance, growth, and reproduction. Just generally speaking. Let me go to the next slide to show that. This is a little bit goofy, but I wanted to include humans on here. So each of these 4 pie charts is showing energy budgets of 4 different species. So we've got a human. Is she pregnant? What's going on here? We've got a human, we've got a penguin, we've got a mouse, and we've got a python. So each of these organisms is going to get energy, but they're going to budget that energy in different ways. So a human is going to spend about half of their energy just on metabolism. So we're warm-blooded or endothermic, and so we're going to keep a core temperature around 98.6. So a lot of our energy just gets burned to generate heat. We're going to spend a small proportion of our energy on reproduction. We're going to spend some of it on temperature regulation. I guess I should have separated the temperature regulation out from metabolic rate, but they are linked. We're going to spend some energy on growth and then spend some energy on activity, right? And so I guess in the previous slide I said maintenance, growth, and reproduction. So here's growth, here's reproduction, and the rest of this is basically maintenance, just staying alive. A penguin is going to have a similar diagram. So they're going to have a metabolic rate, they're going to have reproduction, thermoregulation. It's going to be a little bit higher for a penguin because they're living in Antarctica or wherever, trying to stay warm. And they're going to spend a bunch of energy on activity. So for a penguin, that would mean they're going to spend a ton of energy swimming around in the ocean trying to catch food, walking back to their mate and barfing their food into their mate's mouth. Do you know that's how penguins do it when they're reproducing? And so a lot of activity costs. A mouse is going to spend more energy on thermoregulation because it's a small warm-blooded mammal. It's going to lose a lot of heat, so it's going to have to spend a lot more energy just staying warm. In a python is cold-blooded, so you're going to see that it doesn't really spend much energy, if any, on thermoregulation, so that it's going to save a lot of energy there. And because it's saving energy there, it can spend more energy on eating food, on activity, and on growth. So Anyway, it's just showing, the point is, I'm just trying to show the ways that different species spend their energy. Now, which of these ways is the best? Is it better to be warm-blooded or cold-blooded? Is it better to spend more energy on staying warm or not spend any energy on staying warm? Well, it depends. It's just different for each species. Each of these species has their own energy budget, and they spend energy in a way that's going to help them survive and reproduce. So this begs the question, why do species display different life history patterns? Well, I kind of just answered that. But the book revisits this question. So we've got salmon, oak trees, and deer. Can you see my cursor? Did I make the cursor go away? I don't know. I don't know if you can see my cursor. So salmon will spawn in freshwater streams and swim to the ocean, right? So they're highly transitory. English oaks will just live in one spot and produce lots of acorns and not provide any parental care. Deer will just produce maybe one offspring at a time, but lots of parental care. So again, these different life history patterns of maturation and reproduction, etc., are different for every species, and each species has been shaped by natural selection so that their life history patterns work best for them. So what works great for a salmon doesn't work for an oak tree, and what works great for an oak tree doesn't work for a red deer. They're all inhabiting different aspects of the ecosystem, and there's different selection pressures that have shaped them to be organisms that behave in very different ways. Okay, I've mentioned parental care a couple of times. There's two main patterns of parental care when we're looking at life history patterns. There's passive and there's active parental care. So in passive parental care, the organism invests in reproduction in their offspring before it's born, but not so much afterwards. So here's a species of salamander. It spent a bunch of energy making eggs, and it laid its eggs, and as soon as it lays its eggs, it's going to leave. So they have a lot of upfront costs, but they don't have continuing costs. This salamander invested before birth, and because it produced some eggs, but it's going to display active parental care. It's going to also invest in its offspring after they've been born or after the eggs have been laid. So it might defend the eggs, or it might fan the eggs with water, or it might protect the eggs from predators or whatever. So what are the pros and cons of these? Well, in passive parental care, you can allocate how much resources you want to spend on reproduction. You lay that many eggs and then you're done. You can go on about your day. So that's pretty nice. The negative is you're probably going to have more of your offspring die because you're not there to take care of them. In active parental care, it's the opposite. You might have to lay fewer eggs because you're going to have costs associated with the offspring after they've been born. But the nice thing is you might have a higher survivorship, because you're there to protect them and to take care of them. So which one's better? Well, it just depends. Having passive parental care works for this guy, this gal, and active parental care works for this gal. So it's just different for different species. Another way we can look at it is how many reproductive events does a species have during its lifetime. And we can split this into two categories: simulparity and iteroparity. So a reproductive pattern called simulparity is when organisms devote all of their stored energy to a single reproductive event. So basically they reproduce all at once and then they die. So the salmon we looked at a few slides ago is an example of an organism that undergoes simulparity. They don't reproduce, they don't mate until they swim upstream, and then they mate or they spawn and lay eggs, and then the adults die. Another example of that is mayflies. Maybe you're familiar with these little insects, maybe you're not, but these live underwater when they're immature, and then they emerge out of the water as winged adults. They mate and they lay their eggs, and then they die. So all of their reproduction happens at once. Contrast that with iteroparity, where there are multiple reproductive events throughout their lifetime. So humans display iteroparity. We can have a baby when we're, 18, 22, 29, 45, whatever. We reproduce multiple times. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of each? In simulparity, it allows you to save up your resources and then maximize reproduction all at once. And also an advantage of this is you can overwhelm predators by having all your babies born at the same time. Some of them might get eaten by predators, but because there's so many offspring, then the predators aren't going to be able to eat that many of them. The negative is, what if you live your whole life and become an adult and you haven't reproduced, but then right before you reproduce, you get eaten by a predator? Well, you've kind of, from a biology point of view, you've kind of wasted your life. You haven't reproduced, and so it's kind of an all or nothing strategy. In iteroparity, you can spread the costs out over a lifetime, and so you can reproduce if you have resources available and not reproduce if you do not. And so this allows you to spread reproduction out over your lifespan. However, if you die early, right, same thing, maybe you haven't reproduced, or maybe you've had one kid and then you die, one offspring and then you die, you have not maximized your reproductive success. So it's a little less risky because it spreads the reproductive costs out over time. But it can also be more expensive because you're going to have to pay for reproduction over time, and having babies means you're not going to live as long. So it's also going to come with energy costs throughout your lifetime instead of just saving up the energy costs for the end like you can do with simulparity. When should you reproduce? Well, different life history patterns. Some organisms reproduce early and others reproduce late in their lifespan. So a dog can reproduce and have a litter of puppies when it's about 6 months old. But in humans, they can't reproduce until after puberty, usually in their late teen years. So pros and cons. Well, it's nice to be able to reproduce when you're young. You can have a fast generation time. But the negative is you're reproducing when you're young and you're spending energy reproducing and nursing your babies when you could be using that energy living to an old age or gathering resources. What about late reproduction? The pro is you can spend a lot of energy on yourself so you can get established. You can use that energy on growth and maintenance and surviving, and then save up and reproduce later when you're established. The negative is, what if you die early? Or what if you get eaten? Then you haven't reproduced yet. Or your population can't grow as fast because you're waiting to reproduce until you're older. So there's pros and cons to both of these strategies as well. All right, that's the first half of the chapter. We'll pick up the rest and talk about population dynamics and population growth in part 2.